Welcome back to CBC News Sunday. This week in Toronto, a conference called Combating Hatred in the 21st Century. National Post columnist Jonathan Kay was accused of inciting hatred against Native people. Why? For writing a column that called for the abolition of First Nations reserves. He calls the system an utter failure. We're going to debate the question in just a moment, but first, a few facts. In Canada, a reserve is defined as Crown land set aside for the sole use of First Nations people. The reserve system dates back to the Indian Act of 1867. Officially, there are nearly 3,000 reserves in Canada, but only 600 are actually occupied, with the rest used only for traditional ceremonies. Of Canada's 1.3 million First Nations people, 57% live on reserves. That's according to the Ministry of Indian and Northern Affairs. The federal government spends more than $500 million each year just on reserve housing needs. And yet many are characterized by poverty, disease, and hardship.
Jonathan Kay is the editor of the National Post comment pages. Welcome to the show, Jonathan. Hayden King is a lecturer on Indigenous Studies at McMaster University. Hayden, welcome to you. You wrote a response to Jonathan's column that was published in the National Post, so the debate between you has begun.
Jonathan, let me begin with you. Make your argument for why you think the reserve system should be shut down.
Well, it's simply inhumane. I think it's bad for natives. We've learned from history all around the world that collective land ownership doesn't work. It's one of the reasons the Soviet Union fell. And yet collective land ownership is the only way you can own land on reserve.
Pardon me for saying, though, let me put it as bluntly as this. I don't mean it as bluntly as this, but some people might say, who are you to say what's good or not good for natives?
I'm a human being, and when you see squalor and misery in your country, I think it's a responsibility of every engaged citizen to say something about it, regardless of whether you're Indian or non-Indian.
Well, I mean, hold on a second there, Jonathan. I mean, if you ask any person on a First Nation reserve whether or not they want to move, I mean, that's another question, but I think you'll find that most of them do not. I mean, these are homes, these are communities.
It goes without saying that you wouldn't force people to move. The problem with the current system is you're actually providing economic incentives for people to remain in places often where there are no jobs, where the economy is driven by welfare, and where they can't own their own land, which is something every other Canadian takes for granted. That, to me, is just as much discrimination as what they've suffered in the past.
So where are you suggesting the people go? I mean, once you shut down the reserves, where do people go?
An excellent question, because, I mean, let's look at the condition of urban Aboriginals, for instance. The socioeconomic indicators that are so bleak, and which Jonathan mentions, hold true for urban Aboriginals. I mean, the poor health, education, high infant mortality rates, high suicide rates, low life expectancy. These are across-the-board statistics for First Nations people, whether they live in reserves or in urban centres. I mean, the question isn't the reserve system that needs to change. It's Canada's policy towards Indigenous peoples. I mean, for the last 150 years, as Manny Jules has said, First Nations people have been legislated out of the economy. They've been legislated out of governance.
That's entirely true. But one of the problems, I think, with our current system is we're letting the guilt over all those things, which you say, which is perfectly true, the spirit of guilt and restitution has overpowered our common sense and our humanitarian instinct. We haven't applied lessons from around the world to our Aboriginal communities because we treat them as unique. And culturally, of course, they are unique.
Absolutely.
But they obey the same, they respond to the same economic incentives as people around the world. That means if you create a welfare society, if you don't let them own land, if you put them away from urban job centers and education centers, they're going to respond predictably as any human community would with poverty, with welfare dependence.
I mean, there's plenty of rural towns and, you know, that generate wealth. And we look at how Canada's economy is, you know, fueled by its timber, its oil, its minerals. I mean, it's resource development, and these are all in proximity to First Nations and all in rural Canada. I mean, it's not the isolation that's the problem, and it's not like Canada has some kind of humanitarian streak or is plagued by guilt. I mean, these policies continue to this day.
Hayden, can you respond? I mean, in Jonathan's article, he said each year the federal government spends over $8 billion on reserve resident natives. I'm quoting, or $80,000 per reserve resident household. And he says, quote, and Jonathan, I never get tired of quoting this because it puts to rest the idea that natives are somehow being nickel and dimed under the current system. Jonathan wants to end that $8 billion. And Are those the right numbers?
Absolutely not.
Those are not the right numbers.
What's most often cited is a $9 billion number. I mean, when Jim Prentice was Federal Minister of Indian Affairs, he cited that number quite frequently. But if you look at the budgets, and it's clear as day, right in the budgets, $4.5 billion of that goes to government salaries and lawyers and the bureaucrats. Overhead administration is what they say. So that leaves $4 billion roughly for First Nation peoples. Jonathan said that equates to about $80,000 per First Nation household. There's 4 or 5 individuals in every First Nation household. Now we're looking at $10,000 per First Nation person. CBC reported that Canada spends $80,000 on prisoners in Canadian jails. That means the federal government is spending 1/10 of the amount on First Nation peoples that they are on Canadian prisoners. I mean, these numbers
first
are.
Of all, I think
it's
very the baseline comparison is to prisoners.
It is telling.
Well, but it's telling because it suggests that our view of reserves is such that we're actually imprisoning them there. And I think the comparison should be to ordinary citizens who are free to live wherever they like.
But what about the numbers, John?
It's quite true. When you set up a statist system, a system that is based on government handouts, of course you're going to be spending a disproportionate amount on, as you said, on lawyers, on administrators, on bureaucrats. That is the case with any statist system. If you had a more free market system, which you would get if you shut down a lot of these reserves and you encourage people to get jobs in the private sector, you would not have all this money that's intended for them wasted, as you said, on government administrators. I agree with you on that point.
Jonathan, your radical fix in your article, you talked about literally tearing down, and I'm quoting, installing the inhabitants at government expense in population centers. Like, these are their homes. Now, at the conference I was at, you were accused of inciting hate against Aboriginals for that notion of, you know what, you guys can't make it, we're going to tear your places down and put you in cities. Well, look, what do you think of that kind of comment?
If you accuse me of hatred on the basis of that policy, then you have to accuse others because, look, the government shut down the Labrador community of Davis Inlet. Because it became too dysfunctional, they moved them all down the road to Netetwashush. Kasheshwan, a government-appointed commission found that Kasheshwan in northern Ontario, which of course had a horrible problem with tainted water a couple of years back, that the residents there, that it was simply too dysfunctional community, that the residents there be moved to Timmins, Ontario. I'm not the only person who has concluded that some Aboriginal communities, I'm not saying all, there are many perfectly functional, economically self-sufficient Native communities in Canada, but the most dysfunctional are so stricken by poverty, are so stricken by all these pathologies that it really is more humane to stop subsidizing
I disagree.
third world communities.
I think it's not humane when we don't ask the Indigenous peoples themselves what they want to do. I mean, part of the problem for the last 150, 200 years is that First Nations people are not in control of their own destiny. It's this crushing paternalism from the federal government telling